Mm.
and what Russia is doing in Ukraine. And so am writing this book. I have
Yep.
an agent. I have at least one publisher interested, but my agent's trying to get a few more.
Sure.
The book's about half done, but I know the story line,
Of course.
the story that I'm trying to tell. It's a narrative nonfiction. I don't
Yep.
know everything that my parents
No.
experienced, but I've got a pretty good historical record of what happened to them and filling it up with the stories that they told.
Welcome to the Audacious Living Podcast, hosted by my man, Audley Stephenson, the Odd Man.
Greetings and salutations. It's Audley Stephenson, and this is the Audacious Living Podcast. Thank you for being here. Of course, our goal is to inspire and empower our listeners to live their best audacious lives ever. And, as we head into the summer months, it's so nice to know that you're taking some time out of your schedule and your free time to join us here on our journey. So thank you for making us part of what you do. And as we continue on the path of self-discovery and growth, we'll talk about intergenerational trauma. And, something that's kind of like a shadow that follows generations, shaping our experiences, influencing how our responses to the world around us. And if you think of a tree roots and how deeply they run, so do the effects of trauma in our lives. And it gets passed down from generation to generation, from one to the next, and kind of like that silent inheritance, if you will. Oksana Kukurudza is a writer, storyteller, and has a passion for sharing those untold stories of her own family's journey through World War II. She has a book coming out, The Sunflowers Never Break, where she explores resilience and hope that enabled her parents to survive unimaginable hardships during certainly one of the darkest periods of history. In this episode, Oksana shares her family's experiences of enduring World War II, certainly highlighting the legacy of, again, intergenerational trauma and the importance of resilience in the face of adversity. Really, her story serves as a really powerful reminder of the strength and courage that can be found, and even our darkest times, we absolutely all face them. And so it was wonderful to have Oksana here. Her story was powerful, and you'll hear a lot about her book, and we'll even dive deeper, again, to intergenerational trauma and the harmful impacts that it can have. And so now that we got you all set and you're ready to go, let's turn our conversation over to Oksana. Enjoy. Hey, Oksana, thank you for joining me on the Audacious Living Podcast. It's a pleasure for you to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me, Audley. It's very nice to meet with you today and talk to your audiences.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I know we were juggling back and forth to make this work, and it doesn't matter how many times you fall down, you get back up and you try again. And so we kept doing that. We're here and we're having this chat. So again, thank you for being here. We spend an inordinate amounts of time on this podcast encouraging individuals ways that they can live their best audacious life. Hey, that fits with the podcast name. There's so many ways that can be done. There's so many pathways to do so, and because we're all on our own individual journey. The piece that and it's sort of relevant, to have you part of this conversation is the obstacles in our pathway are unique. And sometimes we encounter challenges that in the moment we believed were insurmountable. We didn't really have a clear vision of what the destination is, but we still launched forward and did what we could, sometimes with what we had in that moment of information, the best information at that moment. And so certainly, your family has endured much. And perhaps we can ask you, or I can ask you, if you can sort of talk to our audience a little bit about your family's journey, and I know you got a book coming out. We'll talk about that as well too. But yeah, let's get a little into your story.
Sure, I'm happy to share it. And as you were describing your definition of audacious, it definitely brought to me, I would say, my transitional journey that I've undertaken. And so for, 25 plus years, almost 30 years actually, I've been involved either in a finance and accounting career, so former reformed CPA, and then went on to 22 plus year career in consulting. And about 2 years ago, a little over 2 years ago, there was a large, significant event in the world that really changed my life, which was the most recent Russian invasion of Ukraine that happened in February of 2022. And over the next 2 to 3 months, as I saw Russia invading Ukraine, and I saw the bombs raining over the cities, the tanks coming in, the people being interned, people just dying. It reminded me too well of an experience or situation that both of my parents had gone through in their early lives. And seeing what I would say would be just history repeating itself on the television for me every night, and in reading of newspapers and on online readings. And I thought to myself, what could I possibly do to maybe spur on a further dialogue or a bigger dialogue in this world about let's not repeat history. And my parents went through World War II. And so many people are aware of events that happened in World War II.
Sure.
And as the war was playing out in Ukraine, I did things like go out and protest, right? Which, was a good start. But what could I do that could be maybe even more game changing? And my parents went through this, crazy period called World War II, where bombs were raining down in Europe. You had, similar dictators and autocratic regimes that were taking over other countries, suggesting that people from those countries were less than subhuman or parasites or non-human. And it's a similar kind of rhetoric that we're hearing in Ukraine today, by Russians, obviously not in Ukraine, but from Vladimir Putin, from Russian media, from Russian generals on the ground. And it was just very scary to me because my parents are of Ukrainian origin. They were born and raised in Ukraine. They were born in the 1920s when Ukraine was under Poland. They're from a part of Ukraine called Galicia. And they were from the areas of Chernobyl and Lviv. And my mother, during World War II, when Hitler invaded from the West, Hitler and the Nazis were offering these great jobs through propaganda, and my mother was sucked into it because she was very poor, living in her village. And when she arrived, they took away her papers, and they basically treated her like slave labor. My father's story was a little bit different. He was just outright deported by the Nazis. So once Ukrainians realized that there weren't good jobs when they arrived in Germany, people stopped coming. And so oddly, this is a little known story. A lot of people know about the Holocaust and some of the other atrocities that happened in Europe by the Nazis or by the Japanese in Asia, but many people don't know that the Nazis forced 13 million people to work in Germany. And the way that they treated the people were very different. So almost half of the people came from Western Europe and were treated kind of close to Germans in terms of getting a normal paycheck and decent living accommodations. However, the Eastern Europeans, the Poles, and the other Slavic nations, they were treated very harshly. I've seen some of the conditions by which they lived and the almost no salary that they received, and the beatings and humiliation that they would receive by the Nazis when they were forced to work during Nazi Germany. And I've been through Auschwitz. I've been through concentration camps, and the living conditions of the forced laborers, and I almost call them slave laborers if they came from Eastern Europe, were pretty close to subhuman. And there's an estimate that that about 2/3 of them lost their lives. And so it's this little known area of European history and World War II history that I believe is very important to come out. One, because these 13 million people, 6+ million of them Slavic, deserve to have their story told.
Sure.
Their story's never been told anywhere. And then secondly, from the experiences and the things that my mother told me, history is repeating itself. And so she talked
Right.
about the bombs, she talked about, being under guard and, almost losing her life to machine guns, and how, Jews were treated, and how, children were stolen during World War II. And these are the same kinds of things that are happening today, and what Russia is doing in Ukraine. And so I'm writing this book. I have an agent. I have at least one publisher interested, but my agent's trying to get a few more.
Sure.
The book's about half done, but I know the storyline, the story that I'm trying to tell. It's a narrative nonfiction. I don't know everything that my parents experienced, but I've got a pretty good historical record of what happened to them, and filling it up with the stories that they told. And the plan is to publish this and to get as many eyes on it as I can,
and increase awareness about
what
a story.
happened.
Right. Yeah. To tell a story that wasn't told, or more to make one more commonly known, if you will. So no,
Sure.
so thank you for sharing that. I just want to go back. I mean, you literally grew up hearing these stories. Like, this is what your parents openly shared about their experiences, or was it something that you sort of found out much later on, and did not tell you, or have you always known about these?
Yeah, good question. So they never talked about it as forced labor. They would just say, "Oh, we went to Germany to work," and I think it was pretty
They watered it
typical
down,
of
don't
that
you
time
think?
frame.
Isn't
They
that kind of
watered it down
my
a
goodness.
lot. They watered it down quite a bit.
Yeah.
My father didn't talk about it at all. My mother would share a bit more. Like, she'd share little anecdotes, like, "Oh, we would go out and work in the snow in the fields, and I would be wearing a dress and not a proper coat, and I didn't have boots on, and my legs were freezing in the snow." Or I would ask her, "So did you earn money from your work when you worked in Germany?" "Oh, well, if I did, there wouldn't have been anything to buy." Like, it was very much watered down. And so it would come in little anecdotes here and there. But then when I was a senior in high school, I wanted to write a school paper, and I was going to use it for college entrance examinations. And I found, I mean, I'm a history buff to begin with, but I found World War II particularly interesting, just because of the horrible atrocities that happened during that time. And so I asked my mother if I could interview her about her time during World War II.
Right.
And I was more interested in understanding, the Jewish Holocaust experience through her eyes. And I didn't realize in interviewing her what a horrendous experience she personally had herself,
Right.
on top of what she witnessed during her time in Germany. And I wrote the 4-page paper.
Yeah.
And I lost it along the way. And I started writing this book without having that paper. And I even went to Germany just at the end of December, early January, to do some primary research with companies that had used forced labor. They also have a museum there. And on my way back, returning here, my sister found that paper.
Oh, wow.
And so I was able to take this paper that was written by, I would say, a naive 16-year-old about my mother's experience leaving home to go to Germany. By the way, when she was 16 years old, she had just turned 17. She was very young. And I had better context by which to read the paper. For example, she told me in our interview that she had hopped on a train to Berlin, hearing that there were better jobs. But when she arrived in Berlin, she was arrested immediately because, one, you weren't allowed to leave your job. You had no control over what job the Nazis gave you, and you had to stay in that job no matter what conditions you had to endure. And if they found you, they would arrest you. Secondly, if you weren't German, you weren't allowed to ride the trains to begin with.
Gotcha.
So
So
she
there
had
was,
2
yes.
marks against her. She
Right,
spent
right.
3 weeks in prison. She never told me what happened to her. But then when I went to Germany at the end of December, early January, I found out what happened to people when they ended up in prison. They were humiliated, they were starved, they were tortured. It was a horrible experience. Many people would come back a shell of themselves
Of course.
after they went to prison. And I didn't have that context when I was 16 years old writing this paper. And so I read it in January with a completely different lens.
Sure, sure.
And it
No.
just
Yeah.
broke my heart because
Yeah.
I had more of the history to it than, and the reality to it, right, than my mother was willing to share.
What part of that story at the age of 16 were you at the age of 16 that compelled you to want to turn it as an assignment for school?
It was because growing up Ukrainian American, so I was born in this country in Rochester, New York, the youngest of 12, and so that's why I still look young, even though my parents were young adults during World War II. And it was because most people thought that I was Russian.
Okay.
And didn't know anything about my history and my culture because Ukraine was a part of the Soviet Union, and everybody just thought anyone who came from the Soviet Union was Russian. And because I was 16 going on 17, I was figuring out my own identity. I mean, that's usually when we start to really understand ourselves, right?
That's right.
And create an identity for ourselves in our late teens and our early 20s. And so I wanted to write that story, one, because I was interested in what happened during the Holocaust in World War II, but I also wanted to educate people back then about my heritage, my culture, my language.
Right.
And one of the, I guess, the bright spots of the war, I mean, I hate to think of anything as a bright spot or, a bit of a, rainbow through dark clouds, is that everyone knows where Ukraine is now. And
Sure.
everyone knows a little bit about Ukrainians, something that probably prior to February 2022, they had never heard of or rarely had heard of.
Yeah, no, understand. I guess you would have had an opportunity to hear from your parents and sort of some of the ways that they were sort of able to endure these difficult challenges that they had to face with. And, in many instances, we know that lives were lost and we understand the impacts on a large scale. Do you have a sense of, what they use as their sort of fuel to push ahead, or how they did it?
I don't know for sure because they didn't talk about it, as we had sort of talked about earlier. They kind of, I don't want to say rose-colored glasses, but they sort of just said, many people were in these horrible conditions, and that's, you just survived, right? And if I think about it now, I believe that they had so much trauma during that period, like almost anyone and everyone who grew up during World War II,
right,
that they just found a way to put it in the back of their minds, and their goal was just to survive the next day.
Understood.
And I believe for both of my parents, one of the things that were very enduring to both of them is that they were both very anti-communist, and they had this appreciation of the United States and of the West, and the idea of democracy and freedom was very strong in both of them. So I believe another thing that kept them going was the hope that the Allies would persevere and would free them at some point in time, and they would have the opportunity to come to a country like the United States.
There's much to be said about maintaining some level of hope.
Absolutely.
Particularly during the most horrendous, challenging times. And so I'm so glad that you touched on that point, because I think that for many is the only way, is the only thing that you can hold on to, because everything else seems so dark. And again, I can't speak enough how powerful hope is and was for them, your parents, obviously, and still is to this day. I'd imagine even through the book writing process and you know, you're doing podcasting news and talking about that, there's a I guess is there a sense of sort of healing, or because I'm also wondering, sort of, as you know, second generation, you didn't face directly, but there was, I would imagine, was there some impact directly on you or indirectly?
There absolutely is. I mean, there are many studies now that show that there's multi-generational trauma,
Hmm.
and it's the legacy of the way that your parents or your ancestors handled their individual trauma
Yep.
and the way that they learned to act to be able
Yes.
to survive their situation,
Right.
and they pass those same acts and actions onto their descendants. So my parents, being considered a less than human or subhuman in Nazi Germany, and basically Slavs were going to be the next group exterminated after they were finished with the Jews and the Roma. They,
Right.
in fact, considered the Slavs to be their slave class, and they were taking over Eastern Europe to give land and resources to
Hmm.
Germans. So I believe that my parents survived by keeping their heads down and kind of acquiescing to the Germans' opinions of them and
Right.
not acting out or being too rebellious.
Right.
In fact, I have stories from my mother's sister about how rebellious my mother was when she was young. But by the time I got to know her, she wasn't rebellious at all, you know?
She let some of that go.
Yes, yes. And that was passed on to me. You know,
Mm.
the feelings of, you know, maybe you're not as good as everybody else because because I watched my parents' actions, right?
Right. Right.
Which was their coping mechanism to continue to survive, right, through old age and,
Yeah.
you know, make a decent life for themselves in the United States. So I've been spending a lot of my time going through this transition of changing careers. So I'm going to do something on my own with a partner of mine, and we're going to focus on things like social responsibility,
Hmm.
diversity, equity, and ESG, which is environmental, social, and governance with companies. Because of what I've learned through my mother's story, is how complicit companies were in the treatment of concentration camp and slave labor. My mother worked for a subsidiary of Volkswagen, to give an example,
Yeah.
and the
Hmm.
company's still here. And what they've done is great. So I'm not knocking Volkswagen because they wrote a history book about what they did. They have a memorial about what they did.
Yeah.
But there are still a lot of companies out there that haven't accepted,
Acknowledge.
acknowledged, accounted for
Yes.
what they
Yes.
did during World War
Yes.
II and their
Yes.
complacency. And there are still companies out there today that are, you know, through their supply chain, there's use of slave labor.
Right.
I think recently, you know, Tyson was in the news for using, you know, young undocumented workers in their meat factories at night. So I believe that companies today are still too focused on profit and not focused enough on what are they doing to give back, and are they operating not just for profit but
Hmm.
in a good socially and equitably minded way. And I believe this is incredibly important because I also have hope that Ukraine's going to win this war one day soon, and they're
Right.
going to need to be rebuilt, and they're going to need to be rebuilt by ethically socially responsible companies that are going to help them extinguish the corruption that they have in their country, and they're going to
Hmm.
become a democratic nation, you know, very similar to our own. And so I'm sort of tying all these things together:
Hmm.
my business career, my family history, and how I can, you know, how I can support a better world in the future, you know, with rebuilding Ukraine, with helping companies be more socially minded.
Well, congratulations for doing so, Oksana. I think you've taken on a tremendous task. And it's certainly not sort of an easy road in front of you in terms of the work that needs to be done. But you certainly are doing honor to your parents and what they endured to be here. And we talked about that on the strength of hope and the resiliency too. I think that's another piece that's a strong theme in this message, in the story rather, the story of resiliency and hope and perseverance, and continue to fight through regardless of the odds. A little bit of rebelliousness on your mom's part didn't hurt too, but yeah, I think that's all important elements, aspects of the story. I do appreciate you sharing them, really do, and I think it's wonderful. The book is available when, you said?
I'm hoping within the next year.
Okay.
So I am in the process of finishing it up. I should have it finished by summer, and I want to find the best publisher I can
Sure.
to publish it and bring it to audiences. The book already has a name, and I don't plan on changing the name. It's called Sunflowers Bend But Rarely Break, and it has some important symbolism to it, and that's why I
Please
would
tell
like
us.
to
Can you
keep
tell us what
the
that
name
is?
intact. Sure. So sunflowers, they're the national flower of Ukraine.
Okay.
And they're also the largest agricultural export for Ukraine in the term of sunflower oil. And so they're basically the lifeline of the country right now in terms of their foreign exports and their foreign currency income. But even most importantly is just the way sunflowers are. So they're very hardy flowers that need so much sun. And we've all seen, field of sunflowers, and we'll see them, on a cloudy day, just bend as far as they can to reach for the sun. And so with that symbolism, Audley, you can imagine why it's a good name for a book about, two people having to bend because of Nazi, power and authority, but not breaking.
Well, it's beautiful. I think it's a beautiful. I don't at all blame you why you don't plan on. It won't change that regardless of what a publisher says. Thank you, Oksana. For anyone who wanted to connect with you directly or to learn about your work in general, where could we send them?
Sure. So I have a book landing page called sunflowersreallybreak.org. Sorry, .com. I think it's .com. And then I also am a prolific writer on Medium. So anyone that reads Medium can find me on there, just looking up my name. And I'm also on Instagram, on Facebook, and on LinkedIn.
Amazing. Well, Oksana, this has been great. I really do appreciate you being here and sharing your story. Very powerful one. I think there's much said to being able to sort of get past situations, pain, trauma. In your case, you're talking about intergenerational trauma, which comes with its own set of issues that might not always come to the forefront for individuals. And so thank you for stepping up in the face of all that and sharing your story regardless. It really is appreciated.
Thank you so much, Audley, for having me. I'm glad I was able to share my story with your audiences today.
Yes, thank you for doing so. Take care.
You too.
Back we are here on the podcast. I'm so thankful for Oksana for joining us. Her story is a testament of the enduring power of hope and resilience in the face of all sorts of unimaginable challenges. Through her work, she not only honors the past, but also inspires us to look forward towards a future where social responsibility and equity guide our actions. To connect with Oksana directly and learn more about her work, I'd encourage you to visit her website at sunflowersneverbreak.com. I totally love that analogy. Or you also can follow her on her social media platforms like Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Certainly keep an eye out for her book. Again, that title is The Sunflowers Never Break. It is available for pre-order on her website. So you can head over there and the link is below. Certainly stay tuned for offers and insights into her storytelling journey. It truly is a remarkable one. Thank you for tuning in to the Audacious Living podcast. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please consider following, or sharing. Of course, this is how this podcast grows, and we continue to grow this community of audacious individuals striving to live their best lives. Remember, each new day comes with new opportunities, so be bold, be brave, and absolutely live audaciously. Take care.
You've been listening to the Audacious Living Podcast, hosted by Audley Stephenson. If you enjoyed what you heard, be sure to like, subscribe, and share. Until next time, be audacious.